My
Yeah.
career started in 1926. I was a student at London University and I was just in my last year. And Charles B. Cochrane had a ball at the Albert Hall, a Charleston ball, he called it. And he invited all contestants of different categories all over Europe and England to come and compete. And I used to go to see shows, and I'd come home and I'd try to do the dances that I'd seen, fool about a bit. And my father said, "Why don't you enter this competition?" I said, "Oh, it's £2.10 or something." He said, "That's all right, I'll pay it." And that really was the beginning of my career and the end of my engineering, because I never once practiced engineering after that. I won the competition, and I competed against some of the finest professional dancers in England. But the only reason I won is I was the only one who kept his feet. They all fell. And the day of the competition, I went down to the floor because my sister was a ballet dancer at the time. And she used to put thin rubbers on the soles of her ballet shoes so she wouldn't slip on a slippery dance floor. And I remembered this, and I went and tested the floor, and I couldn't keep my feet. I had a lot of sliding steps. So I had the bootmaker that afternoon put on some thin rubber soles, and I won because I did a fairly good routine, obviously. But I'm positive today that I won because the others all fell. How can you give a prize to a man who's sitting on his bottom? So from then on, I started. I got an engagement at the Plaza, and danced with a lot of girls, and they had a routine, and the dance director said, "Well, this is what we want to do." I said, "Oh, it's no good to me at all. They'll have to do my routine." I said, "I am not capable enough to follow their dance steps." So they did. So I had an engagement at the Plaza. Then I played the Mile End Empire, and incidentally, Bernie Delfont, who recently was knighted, mentioned the fact that he worked with me once, and he did in his early days. And Lou Grade and I were Sir Lou, I beg your pardon, Lou, were good friends, and he also did Charleston. And then I went abroad and did one or two things, and then I started to write. And then I had some popular songs that were quite big hits in the old days, like I Raised My Hat, and I Was in the Mood, and He Was a Handsome Young Soldier. And the biggest one, of course, was for Jack Hylton, Marching Along Together, which he did at the Palladium. Oh, we had I think it was either the Royal Guards or the Scots Band. I know there were 64 all blasting away with trumpets and bassoons, and it was a wonderful sight. It was great. That was 1932. And then the BBC, Eric Maschwitz, said, I went to him with an idea of sort of a put-on, we called it burlesque in those days, of American commercial shows. And I did a thing called America Calling. And in that, and it was a big success, very fortunately, and I did three versions, three one-hour versions of it. Wrote it, directed it, went in it, performed in it. And it was, in the middle of it, I did a little segment of 5 minutes called Twisted Tunes. And that became quite a big success afterwards for many, many years. And even today, it's a funny thing. Coming into the country recently, the passport man looked at the passport. He said, "Oh," he says, "I know that name, don't I?" I said, "Yes, Twisted Tunes." He said, "Oh, yes, of course." Now, that's a long time ago. It's nearly 50 years ago.
Just coming back to that Jack Hylton
Yes.
episode, how difficult was it in those days to get a song into that sort of orchestra's repertoire?
Well, Jack wanted a song. Jack wanted a song for the Palladium. He wanted something big, and I had worked with him, had known him in small things as a songwriter, and he'd recorded several of my things in the time. And he said to me, I was writing with a Viennese boy at the time, Franz Vienna, and he said, could we do something for a finale? So we sat down and wrote Marching Along Together, and luckily it was a big success. In fact, it still is. It's played. Kate Smith made it a hit again in Depression in America, called the National Recovery Act. And I'm hoping that if I can get a new lyric for it, we might do something with it in 76, 200 years of American so-called independence, and the old British colony. And in those days, it wasn't hard because I used to write things in Ambrose, and I tried to write something for someone like Maxie Bacon. I don't know if many people remember him, but he was a comedy singer at the band. And then, of course, Al Bowley with Lou Stone. Carol Gibbons and I wrote a lot of things together. And we had one or two things in West End shows. And then when the war came, or before that, of course, 19 29, I went to America for 2 years and did a couple of shows on Broadway and wrote a film. Was sent to Hollywood to do a film for Beatrice Lillie. They said, oh, these boys from Britain. In fact, my partner was an American, and of course so am I, but I'd lived here so many years. So we must send them to do a film for Beatrice Lillie called Are You There? But it wasn't, because I think they cut it up and sold it for mandolin picks afterwards, because it was just, I think it was awful. I never saw it. And the songs, nothing ever happened to them. That was one of those things. We went back to New York, and then we had a show on Broadway. We were very young. We were the youngest couple, I think, that ever did a show on Broadway. And it ran for several months. It wasn't the biggest hit in the world, but it was all right. It was a start. And then I came back to England, as I say, and did I was at the BBC in Normandy and Luxembourg for many years until war came, and then I had a family, so I had to make a decision whether to keep the children isolated here, and decided we didn't. So we went back to New York, and where I did radio and wrote songs and things.
Just coming back, I'm sorry to keep pulling you
No,
back.
no, I just keep going on forever otherwise.
Jack Hylton, what sort of guy was he to work for?
Well, he was two people. Personally, Jack was a delightful, charming man, a most hospitable, generous fellow you ever met in your life. In business, he was exactly the opposite. He was hard and ruthless and tough, and there was no sentiment involved in any business deal you ever did with him. It was a cut-and-dried, hard thing of getting on and doing the show and earning your money, so to speak. He really was, in that way, he was a schizophrenic. But we got along well through the years, and at one time, I did a most extraordinary thing, because although I'm musical and play and can write, I've never had any training in the sense of a musical conductor. And he went away, he wanted to go away for 7 weeks to America, and he said, I've got these engagements, will you come and conduct the band? I said, well, no, that's ridiculous, Jack, I can't conduct. Well, he says, stand up in front of it. I said, well, that's all right. And Billy Ternant, who was Jack's right hand and left hand with regard to all the arrangements of music, he said, it's all right, Eddie. He said, we'll beat off, and you just watch the beat 1, 2 with somebody's foot, and then follow us. And I said, well, that's all right. Jack was doing that for 20 years, so why can't I, you see? So we had a big laugh about it, and that's what we did. And, of course, the Melody Maker or something had a big headline, Eddie Pola waves his arms, because that's exactly what I did. But it was fun, and that's what we did.
Why were you supposed to be conducting that?
Because he was away, and he wanted somebody at that time I was pretty well known, and after we played the Palladium together, and he was the top and I was the bottom of the... In fact, we shared at one time. I never can find a copy of that bill, which I like very much. It was Jack Hylton and his band and Eddie Pola and America Calling, 1934, something like that. Because the radio show was such a big hit that Val Parnell said, I think, they started then a vogue of putting on those radio shows that were successful. Tommy Handley went on with his show and played around the country. And we played a big tour for almost a year. You know, all the big towns, Sheffield, Glasgow, and all those places. And
because today, I mean, it seems an extraordinary idea to try to put a radio show on as a visual performance.
Well, there was no television, don't forget. And as far as the visual end of it, it was just a variety show. And the band I used to get, I was merely simply an MC, a master of ceremonies, compere. And I introduced the acts, and I did a little chit-chat with them. And we had impressions, the sort of things that we did in America Calling, which were put-ons of commercial radio. We, for example, we introduced one fellow. We had a Frenchman in the band, Philippe Brun, who was a wonderful trumpet player. And so we did a little bit with introducing Dr. Slopover's shoes. And I said, you try the shoes? He said, oh, yes, I tried the shoes. And I said, well, doctor, what do you do? Meaning, the joke was supposed to be, what do you do first thing in the morning? Put on my shoes. He says, would you tell me what you do the first thing in the morning? He says, oui. I said, no, I mean right after that. And, of course, that was the biggest laugh we ever had in the show. It was strictly an ad-lib thing, because we kept it in. And we had fun, and we did those sort of things. Funny thing happened once. We had Arthur Tracy on the bill with us once. And the street singer, you remember him with the accordion? And he was a big hit all over England. Well, he didn't know the difference between England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales. To him, it was all England. And he used to make a lovely little curtain speech after his great ovation. He'd come out and say, Oh, I'm so happy to be here in England, and I've loved every moment. You British are so wonderful to me, you see. So when we opened in Glasgow after leaving Manchester, he didn't know geographically where we were. He thought we were still in the same place. And on Monday night at the Glasgow Empire, again a big ovation, he says, I'm so happy to be here in England. No, nothing but boos. Naturally, you see, they booed the devil out of him. So he came off the stage, red-faced, and one of the stagehands says, you're not in England now. You better get out there and say something about Scotland. So he did. He went back and he made it this. He says, I love the Scots, etc., and that was all right.
Ambrose, we were talking about.
Yes, well, Bert, of course, was an entirely different kettle of fish from any of the other. He was I think Bert always had a stomach ache. He was not what I would call the happiest man in the world. I really do believe he had ulcers. I'm not sure. But he was a thorough technician and a workman. And the band, as you know, were one of the best musician-like until Ted Heath left him, and Ted Heath formed a similar kind of organization. But Bert played a lot of my things, and Maxie Bacon used to sing several of my songs, which we wrote sometimes just for him. And, of course, he had Elsie Carlisle, and she recorded and made a lot of things. So I knew Bert pretty well, and when television started here, and I went to do some commercial television, Bert was then an agent, and he brought me Kathy Kirby at the time. And rightly or wrongly, I couldn't find a place, but that's neither here nor there. But Bert was, when you say an easy man to work with, I suppose he was, because he just said, look, this is what I want. In other words, I want a pound of fish by 5 o'clock Friday afternoon, and if it's the first-class fish, he did it. If it wasn't, he didn't, and it was as easy as that. There was no question of haggling or changing or messing about. It was right or it wasn't. And then, of course, there was one of my oldest friends and nicest fellows was Carol Gibbons of the Savoy Orpheans, which was one of the early days. And he and I, wrote a few things together, and we did a song, funnily enough, an interpolation in the Vincent Youmans score, which Joe Katz had produced at the London Hippodrome. And that was most unusual, because he bought a show from America called Smiles, and he just wanted another song. So Carol and I wrote a thing called I Wish I Knew a Bigger Word Than Love. I don't think much ever happened to it, but it was in the show. It got all the reviews. That was a funny thing. Every time I picked up a paper, here was, to me, one of the greatest composers of all time was Vincent Youmans. Still think Tea for Two is the greatest song ever written. And there was our little song in the show, which they liked. But Carol, of course, was a great pianist and a charmer. I mean, he was quite different from many others, because half of his success was his graciousness at the piano. I mean, people came to the Savoy just to talk to Carol Gibbons because he stuttered, a little bit, which was charming. And we did commercial radio shows together, and he was a pretty good guy. Then, of course, I worked with I can't think of his name now, Lou Stone, for many, many years, and out with Al Bowley, he sang. They all sang, because when you were a songwriter in those days, you got to the bands. I wasn't a song plugger, but I found that, I went there for dinner and dancing, and so I used to say, hey, I've got a good song, and they would look at it and play it. So that's how I got a lot of them going.
Because Al Bowley was an extraordinary sort of success at the time,
yes,
wasn't he?
Yes, very, very. And he was a good singer. He was a little different from some of the others. And then, of course, there was, in those days, there was Nat Ganella's period. I believe he recently made a comeback. I always remember him singing the Continental. He's quite a different way from anybody else with that gravelly voice. But what other bands were there? My goodness, there were plenty. Oh, and then, of course, Sidney Lipton, the Society band. I knew them all, and they played my songs. But those that I mentioned first, I was a little closer to, especially Hylton, because we did a tour together for years.
What was the original idea behind the canary with the rings and the circles?
Well, now that's a funny story, because Harry Richmond, who was a very, very big star, and he came over here, Café de Paris. Those were the days when those stars went to those places and did an hour and a half, Sophie Tucker, and series one after the other. Well, Harry Richmond, I was in New York at the time, was 1931, and he was playing the Palace, New York. And we were talking one day, because a friend of mine, his pianist, Jack Hylton, was saying that Harry was, doing some gags and things in between these things. So I said, it'd be funny. Why don't we write a song called "My Canary Has Circles Under His Eyes"? Just for no reason at all. I really can't remember. It's such a long time ago. And Harry thought this was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. And he went out on the stage that afternoon. He says, "My next number will be 'My Canary Has Circles Under His Eyes.'" And the audience screamed with laughter. So I said to Jack, "Gee, this sounds great. Let's write the song." So we wrote the song, and a publisher took it. And do you know that I wrote 32 different choruses? They kept me in the office every time an act came in that was playing Jersey or somewhere else. They said, "We need a new chorus for this song." And I was spending my life writing special material for this stupid song. And that was the story of that. But there are I suppose there are romantic reasons for writing songs, but most songwriters, I think, I know I do, you just get an idea of something somebody says, you read in the paper, you put it in the front of your head or the back of your head, except when you write something specially for somebody who says, "I want a march," or "I want a funny song about washing my clothes because I'm doing a routine." Usually those songs are just part of the act and they don't become successful naturally, It's one of those things.
We'll come back to Till the Lights of London, but Harry Roy, because we're staying in the period.
Well, Harry Roy, of course, was a wonderful, I thought, a wonderful, wonderful performer. He was a real down-to-earth, solid bloke, and we wrote a song for him called "Hurricane Harry." There again was an instance of writing something for somebody which was only good for Harry Roy and nobody else. Well, it was his and nobody had his name in it and everything. But he married one of the three great princesses, the Sarawak, or Sarawak. And funnily, a strange coincidence, I don't know what interest it is, but the Rani of Sarawak, we got her flat when we came back to London in 1955. I was very fortunate. She was going back to see the Raja, and we got her lease, and we were there very happily for 7 years, in a very nice flat, very nice. But her daughters, of course, well, everybody knows about them. They were married all sorts of different people. But Harry was a very, very good, solid musician, down-to-earth performer, and had a damn good band, of course. And he played a lot of the things. Well, they all did, as I say. That's, as I said before, how you got the songs played. And, of course, I was on the air myself. I was constantly doing shows with, there were two Americans came over, Chick Ender and Charlie Farrell. And, of course, one of my favorites, I think one of the greatest performers England ever had, was Phyllis Robbins. And I was so upset to find that she just disappeared before she could have reached. She should have been. To me, she was one of the most beautiful, most attractive singers that ever was. But she was a very, how do you put it? Oh, she just loved life, and if I've got 5 bob, let's spend 7 bob, and let everybody have a good time, which was her way of life. It's all right. She never did any harm to anybody. But she was a wonderful singer, and she used to sing, because she went out with us with Hylton, and she made records with Hylton. And I don't know what other bands were there.
Because most of these guys always seem to be larger than life figures in a way, didn't they?
Well, they had to be. They were always in the public eye. And while most of them presented a picture that was genuine, that was themselves, some of them, I suppose, at some time presented a picture which was partly acting. Had to be. They were showmen, I'm sure. I mean, I know that Harry Roy in private life was never quite as flamboyant as he was on the thing. Ambrose was the same, because, as I say, I don't think Ambrose was too well. I don't really know, but and Bert was a big gambler, so he may have been worrying about the previous night's bet. I don't know. And but Carroll was himself, just the same, on and off. And Lou Stone was a sad man, I always felt, but a wonderful arranger. But you see, Lou did another thing. Lou mostly sketched out all his own arrangements, and so did Gibbons. But Ambrose didn't. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think Bert did anything except conduct and tell the boys what to do. And Lipton didn't either. He was a conductor, musician. And, of course, Jack Jackson had a band. I hear he's just come back to England, not too well, I'm afraid. I'm sorry to hear that, because he was a nice fellow, Jack. And Gee, you testing my memory now, you know.
Talking about something which is in a way closer to your heart, that song "Till the Lights of London."
Well, yes, because we had a sort of minor tragedy with it, because it was a very big song here, and there was a twist, because I'm basically a lyric writer. I do write tunes, and latterly, the last few years, I've written more music than I have. I write my own, both. But Tommy Connor, after he'd had a very big hit with I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus, came to me, says, I've got a good idea for a song, Till the Lights of London Shine Again. And I said, well, that's great. And in 5 minutes, we had the song finished. And 1 hour later, it was published. So it was a very quick thing, because it was timely, obviously, it had to be. And it did very well, of course, it was a big song here. And it went to America, and in those days, the way a song became successful is how many records it got. Well, it was immediately recorded by 4 big stars. And ASCAP, which is the American Society of Composers and Publishers, like your PRS is, suddenly had a war of their own. There was a big war going on in Europe, and they had a war of their own with the networks. And the networks refused to come to agreement with them, so they refused to play any ASCAP music, and a thing called BMI broadcast music came into being. And as a result, our Till the Lights of London Shine Again never shone at all. And of course, after that, the war was over, and the ASCAP war was over. That was the end of it. So we never did get anything out of it. And I was very upset, because, well, it was a good song, and I hate to see, you know, it isn't easy always to get a song that's going to move and become, because it could have been the kind of a song that would have been, well, not like White Cliffs of Dover, but something that would have stayed around for a bit. You know, people get nostalgic and do war programs, they would have done it. But now they don't. So,
because Tommy Connor came up with some pretty.
Oh, he had some. Yes,
songs,
he had some good songs. Tommy. I don't know where he is today. I lost track of him. But he had. And he had. He had several good songs. In fact, I wrote several with him. That was the only one that really did any good. But his big song was "I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus Last Night."
Because your other song that I know, which I always thought was had an extraordinary quality about it, was "I Love the Way You Say Goodnight."
Yes, well, I rewrote that for Doris Day. Now, that was written for the film. She wanted there was a scene, and they wanted something in a scene. So, fellow I've been writing with now for the last 20 years in America, George Weil, he's done Andy Williams' show, conducting and doing the music, and Flip Wilson and Jerry Lewis. He's done a lot of shows. And he and I have been partners in that sense for a while. He writes the music, I write the lyrics. And we wrote that specially for her. That was a big hit, you know. And I was telling you funny about songs. You know, these are the bits that make people laugh. At least it made me laugh at the time. The publisher, we wrote a song called Quicksilver. And it was a very big hit in America. And the Doris Day recorded it. And the publisher of the song said he didn't like Doris Day's manager at the time. He's long since dead, so I won't mention his name. So he said, I'll fix him. He said, I'll fix her record. We'll beat it. Because he handled the Andrews Sisters. And he says, I'll get the Andrews Sisters and Bing Crosby to record it on Decca, and that'll kill the other one. And of course, I couldn't have been happier, but, you know, he wasn't going to kill it. But they did it, and of course, in those days, they sold 1.5 million, which was a lot of records. That was one of the biggest records. So I always think these things are amusing, you know. Somebody wants to do somebody a bad turn, and doing an ill wind that blows nobody, and it blew me, so I was all right. But songs are, well, every songwriter. See, they don't write songs today, I'm sure. I've been in one or two of the sessions of some of the groups that they do today, and there's no comparison. They don't write a song. They sit down and write a lot of chords, and somebody says, oh, wait a minute, that's a good phrase, and they repeat it, and then when they've got something going, somebody says, well, what'll we call it? Well, I can't write a song that way. I have to get an idea and feel that it's a. But today it seems that the idea of the song isn't worth a hoot. And some of the fellows say, oh, these wonderful lyrics. But I'm sorry, I can't agree with it. To me, there are songs like "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes" are just great songs, wonderful lines with feeling and meaning. And Even, and they're all protest. Well, I don't want to start knocking today's songs. I just don't like them.
Coming now to your involvement in radio.
Yes.
Again, the sort of temperature and the ambience and everything of radio in those days was so different, wasn't it?
Quite different.
In the late 30s.
Eric Mashwitz, who was at that time the head of radio, there was only one BBC. There was no other radio except Luxembourg, of course, and Normandy. But Eric, I went to the first, as I say, the first time I had anything in 1932. I said, I've got an idea. Somebody said, well, I said, who do I go to? Go and see Mashwitz. So I called up and I said who I was, and I just come back from America and I'd like to see him. And I walked in his office and I said, I've got this idea of doing a put on or send up, I think they used to call it in those days, didn't they? Well, we call it a burlesque of American commercial radio. And what I want to do is to get people to imitate Amos and Andy, who were stars, and they were known here, the Mills Brothers, Burns and Allen, Jack Benny, whoever was known. And he said, that's a great idea. So I said, so we worked it out. And I must tell you what there is in inflation. I wrote, I think 10 songs. It was an hour. And all the jokes and the dialogue in between. I got all the people and produced it, and I was the compere, and I got £100 for the whole lot. Can you imagine that? And that was a lot of money. And then we did. It was a big hit, and then we did 2 more after that, and as I say, Twisted Tunes came out of that, and we did that. Then we did various different shows, odd series, 3 or 4 or 5, because in those days they never did more than that, you know. But it was, I say, it was a different world. It was a package. He'd say to me, you want to do a show? And I'd say, yes, I'd like to do this. He said, all right, go ahead, and they arranged a fee. But I must tell you a little funny story about fees in those days. There was a wonderful fellow there, awfully nice man in the fee department called Arthur Brown, and he was a Scot. He was the right man to have, I suppose, for that job. And he always was very careful about what he paid, and frankly, it wasn't a question so much of money then, although we liked to have it, but it was publicity, and everybody knew it, and he knew it. You know, if you got on the radio, you did something well. Like I say, we were able to play all the theaters because of it. And Jack Benny came over in 1937 for a visit, and the BBC asked him if he'd do a show for them, and he reluctantly said yes, because he was on holiday. So Arthur Brown called me. He said, look, we want to do Jack Benny, and we want to put him in something. I've forgotten where it was at the time. And I said, but this is the biggest star in America. You can't just brush him off like that. I said, yeah, put him in your Saturday night variety show. That's the biggest thing you've got. So he thought about it. He said, yes, you're right. I'll talk to the head of the variety man. So he did, and he called me back. He said, all right, that's what we want to do. Now, what we want you to do is to get with him and do a spot. I said, well, how long? Oh, he said about 5 or 6 minutes. So I said, all right. And I said, now, what about the money? Well, he says, the fee will be 3 guineas. I said, you're joking, Arthur. I said, this is America's biggest star, and you want me to sit down and write jokes for him, and you're going to pay me 3 guineas? I said, I know I'm going to get a lot of kudos and publicity out of it, but damn it all. So anyway, he considered it, and finally they paid 20 guineas. So then I got with Jack Benny, and he was wonderful. We sat, and I wrote a couple of pages, and he edited it and said, well, let's do this, and let's do that, and he worked on it. His wife wasn't very happy, I must say, because they were on holiday, and he was at the Dorchester, and she'd keep coming in and saying, we're going shopping. And he says, that's all right, honey. I've got to get this done. And he did. He worked on that little interview as though it was the biggest thing he'd ever. That's why he's a big star and has always been. Well, we got up and did the show, and it was supposed to be a 4-minute interview. Of course, it ran 7.5 minutes because... and the first line, I think, I flubbed. I just missed it. I was nervous. And he says, what are you getting nervous for? I'm the guest. And, of course, from then on, we were home. But those were the things that radio was fun. In fact, I think it's the greatest form of entertainment of all time because it left a lot to people's imaginations. And I don't know whether you ever had... Do you ever have Fibber McGee and Molly over here? I don't think so. Well, they had a gag in their radio show. It was just a couple, an older couple. and he had a cupboard, and it was always full of all the oldest things in the world. And he'd go to the cupboard for something, and she said, "No, no, no, Fibber!" And he'd open the cupboard and crash, all this stuff would fall. And they did it every show, and you waited for this sound. You can't do that now, because once you've opened the cupboard and seen it, the joke's gone, you see. Well, Benny did it too. He had a wonderful, wonderful routine, and where he had a vault for his money, because you know it was parsimonious gimmick he had all his life. He had a vault down deep under the ground, and the radio sequence was, somebody came to him and said, "Mr. Benny," he says, "this bill is $20. He says, "$20? Who has that kind of money in his pocket?" Wait a minute. And now you go and you hear a large key opening, and you hear a big clang of an iron gate, and that closes, and the key closes. And then you hear footsteps that must have gone on for 2 minutes down a hall, and another door opening, and more footsteps. And you laughed all through this thing, and then finally got down to the thing, and a sepulchral voice says, "Who's there?" And he says, "This is Mr. Benny." "Oh, Mr. Benny, come in. I haven't seen you for years." And this fellow talks about the Civil War. I don't think he's been out since the Civil War. Well, that was radio. You can't do that today. Today, to get sight laughs, a man's got to drop his trousers or smack a girl on her backside, and or something like that. But I loved radio, I must say, and I'm reluctant to see it. It was more fun. It was easier to do, and whether people enjoyed it. But it's coming back, you know. In America, they're playing all these old shows that I've just mentioned. Fibber, Biggie, and Molly. They're playing the tapes, and you can go in the shop and buy a cassette. And they're playing Jack Benny shows and Bob Hope shows and oh, you name it. They've got half. They're even doing new live ones of dramas, written specially for today, half-hour dramas, series, and all sorts of things. But of course, I don't know what audience yet. It takes a little while. In the summer, they'll get an audience because we have these god-awful repeats all the time, you know. Fifth-generation film, on all the night scenes you can't see. See, your color is so much better than ours. There's no comparison at all.
This first musical in
Yes, it was the first. It was the first musical film. It was called Harmony Heaven at Elstree, and I had an idea for the story, and I took it to them. And Arthur Wimperis wrote the script, who was then preeminent as probably one of the nicest and top writers of the country. And we wrote several songs for it. One called "I'm in Harmony Heaven when I'm with you" was an interesting little exercise, because it was for those days, I suppose it was all right, but today it would be diabolical. I don't think it was awfully good then, but it was an exercise in the beginnings. And then as an actor, I was a very poor actor. I played in On Your Toes at the Palace, played the songwriter. And that had Vera Zorina in it, who was a big ballet star, and she was the main thing, because that was the Hart and Rogers show, and I sang a song in that. When I say I sang it, I talked it mostly, and then I did. I made a film with Eve Lister, who was a big star later on in King and I, and another show, Jerome Kern show, which I've forgotten the name of for the moment, but we did a film for Ernest Butcher, with Jack Payne, and my wife said that I was very fortunate that the night it was shown I had flu, because she wouldn't, when she came back, she said, "Well, I don't think I'll tell you now," and that wasn't so good. But then I did a film with Will Hay, and that was very funny. That was very good. And then I did the first film, I think, that James Mason, he was the star, and I was second in it, called Catch as Catch Can. And this goes back, of course, over 40 years.
This musical film, did you have any experience of working in Hollywood at that time? I mean, was this a new venture completely?
No, I had been in Hollywood. Yeah, because I'd been in Hollywood in 1930, you see, with that film that we were supposed to write for B. Lilly, which I told you about that. So then we came back and did this thing here, because those were early days for musical films, you know.
What was the differences, Eddie, between the two working methods? Were there?
Today, none. Then, a difference of professionalism. I remember in those days when I lived here, we never went to a British film. If we wanted to go to the films and somebody would say, well, it's a British film, we never went because we knew automatically it was dreadful, and they were. They were very, very bad. But funnily enough, once they started to make good ones, we preferred those to a lot of the big American films. And as you know, well, today there's no difference. They both make. Yeah, I think it was a question of technique. It wasn't a big industry, you mustn't forget, in those days. But in America, it always was a big industry. The British film industry, to my knowledge, in those days in the early days of 20s, was a sort of a hit and miss thing. Oh, we've got a few bob, let's make a film. I mean, some of them were fair, but I don't think they ever made. I can't recall any great films. Corder was the first one to come along, but then he was later, wasn't he? He was in the late 30s. And I did something for Cord at one time.
I was just thinking of your particular experience with that picture, the musical picture.
Well, really, we had little more to do than, as I say, I provided a story which Wimpress was just an idea. It really wasn't a story. It was an idea. And we wrote 4 or 5 songs, and we went down when they did them. But there wasn't any excitement. I can't remember anything that would amuse you, and it was just, you know, it was done very quickly, I can tell you that. There was not much time taken, you know, one take and boom. I'm afraid it looked like that. But it was interesting. It was exciting for those days. After all, we were only beginning, you know. None of us really knew what to do. I mean, I knew how to write a song, and the director presumably knew how to direct the performer in the song. And also I had a strange distinction with these firsts. I wish to heaven they'd been bigger successes. Was doing the first television show in America, musical. And I'm not sure it wasn't the very first one that went out in transmission. Because in 1940, RCA was experimenting. And I was then working for NBC in New York and radio, of course. And I knew they were going to do this. They were thinking about it. And I had an idea called Soldier Town with a fellow. And we did 2 episodes only. And then the government said no more transmissions because of the war imminent, you see, right at the end of 40. And so they thought there'd be trouble, and they decided to squash it. And they weren't really ready. But England had television before, because they were doing television here, before they were doing television here, I think in 35, something.
That's right, yeah.
I can't remember what it was.
When you became involved in television after the war here,
yes,
what sort of shows were you involved in then?
The first television I was involved in here, of course, was commercial. I went to work for Granada when they first started. I helped set them up because I was the only one that had any experience at all. And of course we had to have schools to teach the fellows. We got boys from, some of the BBC men came to work for us. We had people from the theatre who had been directors or performers or writers, etc. And it was a hodgepodge, it had to be. Again, it was beginnings, pioneering, you see. I have a very funny feeling one of my ancestors must have gone across America in a covered wagon, I don't know. But those were fun days, that's when it was fun. Now it's not, I must say it's not fun. It's just a lot of hard, slogging work. And I think a lot of the fun has gone out of it, and because the fun has gone out of it, so is the creativeness. Because it's now a question of tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock, you've got to have a pound of salmon and 3 potatoes, and just get it there. Not a question of changing it and doing something different. You can, but there's not much time. You know, you're always against the clock. So, but nowadays I don't think there's any, I think most British television is certainly the stuff you do here at the BBC is far superior to anything we do at home, quality-wise. Stars, something else again. You know, you get big names.
Coming back to those early days of what we call independent television here, you know, the
Yes,
commercial things.
yeah.
In a way, the BBC were doing in the musical areas, they were doing a very sort of serious
Far
style
more, yes.
of musical,
Well,
music shows, I should say.
Yes, yes. You'd have Eric Robinson. I've always maintained there is no big audience for this, but the BBC's tastes were naturally. I talked sometimes in those days to the director, who was responsible, somebody in responsibility, an executive, and I would say, "Why is it you do these things?" Well, we said we have a responsibility as a government. operation to the entire public. And I understand that, because I know that, for example, from independent television, if there was a Mozart concert on and we put on anything opposite it, they would get no audience. But that happened to us too. I'll never forget, I was able to get Maria Callas to do a show on her own. Well, as soon as we announced it, I had more friends than you could shake a stick at. Everybody came out of the woodwork. Can I have tickets? Can I have tickets? Can I have tickets? And of course, the night we did it at Chelsea, as a matter of fact, the old Chelsea Palace, which we used, and it was jam packed with people in dinner jackets. For heavens, the women were all dressed up as though they were at the opera. And it was only a television. Sure, it was Maria Callas in her prime, mind you, and we did this show, and of course the newspapers were glowing in their tributes. Television had done this with this great star, and all our people at Granada were naturally very pleased. That's why we did it. But we got the lowest rating I think we've ever had for a major show, because I've always maintained that there's no big audience for what I call classicals or philosophy. In other words, any erudition. My attitude's been, if a fellow wants erudition or concerts, go to the concert hall. And I made a little survey at one time to find out from people, why do you go to a concert? And it got different answers. One man says, well, I like to be in the company of other people who love music while I'm listening to it. Another one says, well, I love to watch the orchestra and watch the flutes when they play and the oboes when they play, and I don't want a television camera pointing it out to me. And a third one says, well, I know these scores so well that I'm interested in watching the performance and seeing how they perform the bits that I like, etc. So they all had different reasons, none of which really fitted a television show. And of course, you mustn't forget, no matter how good your sound is, it's not the same thing as being there. So I've eschewed doing anything in the line of, because I was light entertainment head anyway. I wasn't concerned with too much of the cultural things. But there's an audience. People like to listen to a good pianist play Chopin or Liszt or whoever, whatever. But you might just as well sit home and listen to it on records. That's my personal attitude. And of course, today in America, you'll hardly ever hear. We do have, they have another angle, you know. We have public service, what they call public, which no commercials at all, and that's subsidized by various companies, and the networks themselves provide a lot of funds for that. They have to. The government doesn't force them to, but they feel obligated. And of course, all your best BBC shows are on those things. But they will play what they call the Boston Pops, which is Arthur Fiedler. And this is a big concert orchestra, but they do it quite imaginatively, and they get good performers. So it really is what you might call a classical variety show, except that they play pop musics. They did a concert of the Beatles, with their arrangements, of course, and not attempting to sing or perform like the Beatles, just the music. And they get good performers, and sometimes they get solo pianists. But it has a limited audience. I mean, no sponsor's going to buy it. I mean, for example, a soap company isn't going to put it on at 9 o'clock because they'd get killed by some old John Wayne movie if you could almost do anything like that. But that's life.